Imagine a queen whose life was once filled with crowns, power, and political intrigue, suddenly reduced to the confines of a single stone tower. For 30 long years, she lived in shadows, her days measured by narrow windows, distant bells, and the footsteps of guards she could neither trust nor command. Outside, kingdoms waged wars, alliances shifted, and history moved forward, but she remained unseen, unheard, and largely forgotten. What was it like to endure decades of isolation, where every day felt like the last, yet the mind refused to surrender? Behind these ancient walls, a story of survival, cunning, and endurance unfolded, one that history remembers in whispers, rumors, and the echoes of a queen who refused to disappear. The queen who drew the short straw. Most people imagine queens lounging in gilded halls, draped in velvet, and spending their days nibbling swan legs or giving orders to armies of servants. What they rarely picture is the far less glamorous version of royalty, spending 30 years shut away in a tower, with damp stone walls, stale bread, and rats for company. That was the fate of Margaret of Anjou, queen consort of Henry VI of England, whose life shifted from courtly influence to prolonged confinement. Born on March 23, 1430, in Pont-à-Mousson, in the Duchy of Lorraine, Margaret arrived into a world of divided loyalties and ambitious claimants. Her father, René of Anjou, carried titles Duke of Anjou and claimant to several thrones but limited resources. The marriage market of the 15th century treated noble women as political currency, and Margaret was no exception. In 1445, she married Henry VI in a union meant to cement a fragile peace between England and France. Henry, however, was an unstable monarch whose frequent episodes of mental illness left political leadership in perilous hands. Margaret did not accept the role of ornamental queen. She intervened in governance, negotiated alliances, and took an active role during the unfolding Wars of the Roses between the Lancastrian and Yorkist houses. That involvement earned her bitter antagonists. Chroniclers and opponents labeled her the she-wolf of France, a pejorative reflecting political hostility more than historical accuracy. Her determination became a political liability when military fortunes turned. The pivotal collapse occurred in 1471. On May 4, at the Battle of Tewkesbury, Lancastrian forces suffered a decisive defeat, and Margaret's only son, Edward of Westminster, was killed. Henry VI, meanwhile, who had already been deposed, was taken captive and died soon after in the Tower of London on May 21, 1471, under circumstances still discussed by historians. With her husband dead and her son gone, Margaret stood isolated at the center of a political settlement that had no place for her. Edward IV of York, the victor, faced a choice. Executing an anointed queen risked inflaming Lancastrian sympathies. Banishment could be complicated. Imprisonment provided a practical option. Margaret was confined initially in the Tower of London, the familiar royal prison on the north bank of the Thames where nobles, rebels, and pretenders were held. Accounts suggest she was kept in private chambers rather than a subterranean dungeon. But private chambers still meant curtailed liberty, constant surveillance, and the end of her public agency. Imprisonment carried logistical realities that undercut any romantic notions. Meals were controlled and sparse compared with court banquets. News arrived filtered through guards and messengers. Correspondence required authorization. The tower's rooms had stone floors and narrow windows. Drafts and dampness were perpetual concerns. For a woman who once moved through courts in Winchester, Rouen, and London, the change to confinement in stone represented not only a loss of freedom, but also a redefinition of identity. By 1476, political and diplomatic calculations shifted. King Louis XI of France, who had little affection for Margaret yet preferred to manage the situation from a distance, arranged her ransom and transfer back to France. She returned to lands associated with her family in Anjou, where she remained effectively under house arrest for decades. The move did not restore her influence, rather it relocated her isolation to French territory under royal supervision. For Margaret, the arc from a politically engaged queen to a marginalized prisoner was neither sudden nor accidental. It followed a sequence of military defeats, dynastic loss, and deliberate choices by victors who preferred containment to execution or restoration. 30 years in confinement was less a dramatic climax than a long, grinding policy decision by kings and councils who treated an inconvenient royal figure as a manageable liability. The public memory of Margaret's captivity would later blur into legend and partisan caricature, but the concrete facts: birth in 1430, marriage in 1445, defeat in 1471, transfer in 1476, anchor a narrative of a woman whose political life ended not with a single dramatic moment, but with prolonged bureaucratic erasure. Her tower was not just a building, it was an instrument of political neutralization that would shape how contemporaries and later historians perceived her life. Her confinement would ripple through dynastic politics and personal reputation for decades to come. Court intrigues and bad decisions. Royal courts in the 15th century were not peaceful retreats of poetry, dancing, and polite debates over falconry. They were battlegrounds where family rivalries, noble ambitions, and royal insecurities collided daily. For Margaret of Anjou, wife of King Henry VI, the English court became a pressure cooker, where every decision carried the potential for betrayal. Her eventual downfall into imprisonment was not the result of one mistake, but of a chain of intrigues shaped by the brutal logic of medieval politics. Henry VI's weakness as king was the first crack in the foundation. In August 1453, news of the loss of Bordeaux and Gascony struck England like thunder. Soon after, Henry suffered a breakdown that left him unresponsive for more than a year. He could not speak, could not recognize faces, and could not rule. In a monarchy where authority flowed entirely from the crown, this was a catastrophe. Margaret, only in her early 20s, tried to take control, but the nobility was already divided. Richard, Duke of York, saw himself as the obvious candidate to guide the realm. His ambition quickly set him against the Queen. The birth of Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, in October 1453, should have strengthened her position. Instead, it deepened suspicion. Yorkists whispered that the child was illegitimate, conjured to block Richard of York's claim. The truth mattered less than the rumors. In a kingdom boiling with factional disputes, gossip became a weapon, sharpening divisions that already threatened civil war. Parliament in the 1450s resembled a battlefield of words. Margaret insisted on her son's rights, while Yorkist supporters argued for Richard as heir presumptive. Every appointment, every dismissal, carried symbolic weight. Was the crown favoring Lancaster or York? What might have been minor disputes under a stronger king became fuel for open hostility. By 1455, political tension erupted into bloodshed. On May 22, the First Battle of St. Albans was fought, marking the beginning of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VI was captured, and Margaret faced a new reality: a powerless husband, a contested child, and a throne slipping away. Instead of retreating, she became the face of Lancastrian resistance. She raised armies, sought support in Scotland and France, and fought to preserve her son's inheritance. These were not ordinary tasks for a queen consort. They were survival tactics. Margaret's determination only made her enemies more resolved. Chroniclers called her domineering, ruthless, and foreign terms meant to diminish her. The infamous nickname She-Wolf of France was flung at her not only as insult, but as propaganda. It reminded the English that she was an outsider, a Frenchwoman bringing foreign influence to England's throne. Xenophobia and misogyny worked together to paint her as unfit for authority. The disastrous Battle of Northampton in July 1460 revealed how fragile her position had become. Lancastrian forces were routed, and Henry VI once again fell into Yorkist custody. Margaret fled north with her son, clinging to the loyalty of a shrinking circle of nobles. Each defeat drained her resources, and Yorkist propaganda grew stronger, portraying her as the architect of England's misfortunes. The final blow was betrayal. Noble families who once marched at her side switched allegiance as Yorkist victory seemed inevitable. Even Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known later as the Kingmaker, turned against her. He had once supported the Lancastrians, but ambition and opportunity made him their fiercest enemy. With allies like that, Margaret hardly needed more foes. Yet even in her darkest moments, killing her was not considered an option. Executing a queen consort was politically dangerous. Margaret was crowned and anointed, Her marriage to Henry tied her to the sacred fabric of kingship. To spill her blood could destabilize legitimacy for all rulers, Yorkist and Lancastrian alike. The safer option was to strip her of influence without shedding royal blood. And so the logic of the time declared, if you cannot kill a queen, you lock her away out of sight, but alive. By the end of the 1460s, the web of intrigues, defeats, and betrayals had narrowed Margaret's choices to almost nothing. She had faced accusations of adultery, seen armies collapse, endured relentless propaganda, and watched supposed allies abandon her. For her rivals, the verdict was simple. A queen who tried to rule had to be removed from the game. And in medieval England, removal meant stone walls, barred windows, and guards who ensured that politics continued without her interference. Welcome to the Tower. Check-in, no check-out. Being captured as a queen in 15th century England was not like being tossed into a filthy dungeon with chains and rats. It was subtler, yet in many ways more devastating. Royal prisoners were not humiliated outright. They were neutralized. When Margaret of Anjou was finally confined, the crown ensured her body was safe, but her voice silenced. To be locked in a tower was not merely a physical sentence, it was the stripping away of political agency, a transformation from player to pawn. Margaret's first taste of captivity followed the Lancastrian defeat at the Battle of Towton in 1461. This clash, fought in a snowstorm, was one of the bloodiest battles in English history. The Yorkist victory secured Edward IV's claim to the throne, while Margaret and her young son were forced to flee. For a time, she avoided capture by moving between Scotland and northern England, clinging to scraps of support. But each year that passed tightened the Yorkist grip. By the mid-1460s, her options had dwindled. Her confinement was not at first a brutal dungeon sentence but a genteel imprisonment. Queens, after all, carried ceremonial weight. Margaret was lodged in strong castles, places like Wallingford or the Tower of London, where she was guarded with courtesy but denied freedom. These castles were designed as symbols of royal might, their thick walls and barred windows doubling as both protection and prison. Margaret learned that in England, stone could speak, and what it said was, "You are no longer welcome at court." The irony was bitter. Margaret had once ruled the court as queen consort, commanding loyalty and shaping policy. Now, those same chambers of power had spat her out and locked her away. The courtiers, who once bowed to her, passed judgment from afar. For them, her confinement was convenient. She was alive, which maintained the illusion of mercy, but she was powerless, which ensured stability. Life inside confinement was a strange mixture of formality and futility. Margaret's rooms were furnished, her attendants polite, her meals provided, but everything was controlled. Letters were monitored, visitors restricted, rumors exaggerated. To survive in captivity was not simply a matter of enduring stone walls, but of enduring invisibility. A woman once, at the center of politics, now existed in the margins. Her presence noted only to remind others that she could not act. For Margaret, the greatest wound was separation from her son, Edward of Westminster. The boy she had fought to place on the throne was taken from her side. Medieval politics viewed heirs as prizes. By removing him from her company, the Yorkists denied her the only leverage she still held. Without Edward, she was a queen, without an heir. At her disposal, a chess piece, trapped at the edge of the board. The Tower itself embodied this cruel paradox. Built to intimidate enemies and awe subjects, it was both palace and prison. Queens had entered its gates in triumph, riding toward coronation. Others, like Margaret, entered as captives, stripped of dignity. From its battlements, she could gaze at the Thames, where barges carried courtiers and merchants about their business, while she remained frozen in time, waiting on the whims of men who despised her. Her treatment was carefully balanced. Too much cruelty risked making her a martyr. Too much leniency risked her escape. So she lived in a twilight existence, watched but not tortured, guarded but not degraded. The psychological weight was immense. To be a prisoner with comforts was to be reminded daily of what had been lost. Each polished goblet, each woven tapestry, was an echo of freedom denied. What must have haunted her most was the knowledge that her imprisonment was not a final act, but a suspension. She did not know if the Yorkists would keep her alive indefinitely, trade her for advantage, or quietly remove her should the political winds demand it. A queen in confinement was a tool, and Margaret had become one. Thus, the phrase "check in, no check out" was no jest. Once locked in the tower, few ever left on their own terms. Margaret's story in captivity was not marked by dramatic escapes or daring rescues. It was defined instead by the slow erosion of her identity as queen. She remained alive but politically erased, a reminder that in the brutal chessboard of 15th century politics, survival itself could feel like defeat. The original room service. Rats, servants, and mold. Life as a royal prisoner was not chains and dungeons from a fairy tale. For Margaret of Anjou, captivity was a harsher lesson. Stone walls instead of gilded halls, monotony instead of power, and the daily humiliation of knowing her enemies dictated every detail of her existence. She was not forgotten, but neither was she free. At first glance, her chambers might have seemed decent. A fireplace, a bed curtain for privacy, and a few servants suggested comfort. Yet comfort in the 15th century was far from modern imagination. The stone walls sweated moisture, the hearth filled the room with smoke, and the bed itself, though draped in cloth, often crawled with lice. Furniture was heavy, dark, and practical, designed for endurance rather than pleasure. Even a queen scratched through the night. Meals arrived as clockwork, carried on trays by attendants who were as much jailers as helpers. The food was not poor. Margaret ate better than common prisoners, but it mocked her memory of feasts. She received bread, often coarse, pottage thick with beans or barley, roasted meats that were sometimes lavish, sometimes stringy. Fish made appearances, but not always fresh. Ale or watered wine replaced dangerous drinking water. The fare kept her alive, but it dulled her spirit. Each bite was another reminder of what had been lost. The contrast with her past could not have been sharper. She had once presided over banquets heavy with silver, music, and laughter. Trumpets had announced dishes, dancers had whirled between courses, poets had recited lines in her honor. Now her meals unfolded in silence, broken only by the scrape of trenchers and the shuffle of guards' boots. A feast had been an expression of majesty. Prison meals were an expression of survival. Her servants reflected this same decline. They were careful, polite, but subdued. Every gesture was weighed, every word overheard. A loyal whisper could be reported as treason. A careless glance could be twisted into betrayal. They performed their duties, but the grandeur of serving a queen dissolved into the routine of serving a captive. Margaret was never alone, yet she was lonelier than ever. And then there were the rats. No castle, no matter how mighty, was free of them. They thrived in the rushes strewn across the floors, feeding on scraps dropped from plates. They darted through cracks in the stone, their scratching filling the silence of the night. Margaret, who had once been compared to a lioness on the battlefield, now shared her nights with vermin. The humiliation was bitter. Rats did not respect crowns. The conditions carried their own poisons, rushes soaked with grease and waste-bred insects. Mold clung to the walls, an odor of dampness that never lifted. Smoke from torches and hearths turned the ceilings black. The air was thick, heavy, almost greasy. It was an atmosphere not of immediate danger, but of slow decline, as if the building itself conspired to grind down body and spirit. And still, forms of ceremony clung to her. Guards bowed, servants addressed her as "Your Grace," and meals were announced with ritual. These courtesies, meant to preserve dignity, instead mocked it. Margaret remained queen in title, but the hollow rituals reminded her that she wielded none of the power those titles implied. She had the appearance of majesty, without its reality. What gnawed more than rats or mold was time itself. Days blurred into each other. Morning meant another guarded meal, afternoon another round of silence, evening another restless night. Outside her windows, life moved on. London bustled, armies marched, alliances shifted. Inside, the world shrank to the length of her chamber. For a woman who had once moved armies and kingdoms, the confinement was a sharper punishment than any blade, and yet she endured. She learned to pace her chamber like a battlefield, to measure her silences as carefully as her words. She remained alert, noting every gesture, every murmur, every chance for news. The tower was meant to silence her, But Margaret turned survival into resistance. She refused to vanish quietly into the stone. This was the cruel genius of royal imprisonment. It did not kill its victims outright. It buried them alive in rituals of respect and routines of decay. Margaret was not starved, nor was she executed. She was simply reduced, day by day, to a life where survival itself became her only crown. Hygiene behind bars. If you imagine medieval prison life as dirty, smelly, and unhealthy, you are not wrong. For Margaret of Anjou, stripped of her courts and her freedom, the greatest insult was not only being watched but being forced to live in conditions that quietly eroded dignity. Hygiene behind bars was less about luxury and more about survival. And even queens were not spared the grim realities of medieval cleanliness. Medieval standards of hygiene already puzzled later generations. People did wash, but not with the frequency or ease expected today. A queen in her palace might have had access to perfumed waters, linen towels, and servants ready with scented herbs. In confinement, the difference was stark. Bathing was a rare privilege, arranged awkwardly with a wooden tub dragged into the chamber, buckets of heated water poured in, and attendants hovering. Privacy was minimal, and modesty was impossible. The ritual became less a pleasure and more a humiliating reminder of dependence. Water itself was a challenge. Castles were not equipped with modern plumbing. Wells could provide clean water, but supply was limited and often rationed. For prisoners, water was measured out with an eye toward necessity rather than comfort. A queen, who once rinsed her hands between courses, now rationed cups of water to wash her face. The scarcity transformed cleanliness into a daily negotiation between what she needed and what her keepers permitted. Clothing, too, bore the marks of captivity. Fine silks and brocades had long been replaced with more durable, practical fabrics. Laundering was irregular, sometimes done within the tower, sometimes outside and returned days later. In the damp, smoky environment, clothes absorbed odors quickly. Even queens could not escape the sour smell of sweat mixed with mold. Linen undergarments meant to be changed frequently, often lingered too long between washes, another indignity that reminded her she was no longer mistress of her household. Toilets, or garderobes, were little more than stone seats built over shafts that emptied into cesspits or directly into the moat. They stank constantly, breeding flies in the summer and freezing solid in the winter. Servants had to clean them, but the odor lingered. Margaret, once accustomed to perfumed chambers, now endured the smell of waste drifting through her quarters. The garderobe was a daily confrontation with her reduced status. Royalty had always been elevated above such filth. Imprisonment forced her to share it. Dental hygiene was equally grim. Tooth powders existed, made from crushed herbs, salt, or charcoal, but supplies were inconsistent in prison. Meals heavy with bread and meat left residues that clung to teeth. Breath soured, gums ached, and discomfort grew into pain. Margaret endured it silently. A queen could not complain about toothache when her crown itself was gone. Worse than the lack of washing was the infestation it encouraged. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs thrived in the rushes spread across the floor and the straw stuffed into mattresses. Rats brought more parasites, and every scratch risked infection. Itching was constant, sores common, and the cycle of irritation wore down the spirit as much as the body. A woman once adorned in jewels now battled vermin with her fingernails. Yet Margaret was not entirely helpless. Even in confinement, rituals of dignity mattered. She insisted on combing her hair daily, binding it neatly to remind herself she was still a queen. She demanded fresh rushes when possible, clung to the smallest routines of order, and prayed as she washed her face with rationed water. Cleanliness became an act of defiance. If her enemies wished to strip her of majesty, she would resist by keeping what dignity she could. This struggle for hygiene was more than physical. It was symbolic. Every bath denied her, every foul odor she endured, was a reminder of power lost. But every small success, a comb passed through her hair, a tunic aired out in the sun, became a quiet triumph. The tower was designed to break her spirit as much as her body. By clinging to cleanliness, Margaret reminded herself that though she was confined, she had not surrendered. Hygiene in prison was not simply about staying alive. For Margaret, it was about refusing to be reduced entirely to her circumstances. In the stench of garderobes, the crawl of lice, and the scarcity of water, she fought to remain more than a prisoner. She fought to remain a queen. Fashion in captivity. Clothing in the 15th century was never just about covering the body. It was a political language, a walking advertisement of status, wealth, and power. Queens and noblewomen knew this better than anyone. Margaret of Anjou had once glittered in silks and velvets, her gowns embroidered with gold thread, her sleeves heavy with pearls, her presence as dazzling as any coronation banner. But once the tower's doors shut behind her, fashion became less about declaring majesty and more about clinging to scraps of identity. Captivity stripped away the extravagance. Royal wardrobes were maintained at enormous expense, trunks of garments for every occasion, from processions to private audiences. In prison, there were no coronations, no hunts, no masks to prepare for. Instead, Margaret was issued clothing deemed suitable for her status as a prisoner. Practical, durable, and often depressingly plain. The silks were gone, replaced with coarse wool, serviceable linen, and colors chosen by others. She was dressed not to impress but to endure. Still, clothes mattered deeply, even behind stone walls. The very act of dressing was one of the last ways Margaret could assert dignity. A neatly laced gown, however modest, marked her as more than a captive. Servants recorded how imprisoned nobles often fussed over collars, cuffs, and veils, refusing to surrender entirely to neglect. Margaret, raised in a French court that prized elegance, surely did the same. To appear slovenly was to admit defeat. The symbolic humiliation of captivity often lay in the clothes denied rather than those supplied. Stripping a queen of jewels, crowns, and fine fabrics was not just about thrift. It was about erasing visual reminders of majesty. Chronicles from the period note that captives were often paraded in plain dress to signal their fall from grace. Margaret, who once used gowns as weapons of authority, now found herself costumed as someone ordinary, her very image rewritten by her enemies. Even practical garments brought discomfort. Wool scratched, seams chafed, and poorly tailored gowns restricted movement. Washing was irregular, so dresses grew heavy with sweat and smoke. Winter cold seeped through thin fabrics, forcing prisoners to pile on layers, while summer heat made even simple gowns stifling. The tower did not provide wardrobes with seasonal variety. Prisoners endured with what they were given. Each day in the same outfit blurred one day into the next, time measured not by feast days, but by how long a dress lasted before falling apart. Head coverings were another small battlefield. In medieval courts, a queen's headdress was practically a crown in its own right. Towering structures of velvet, silk, and jewels that proclaimed wealth and sophistication. In captivity, those elaborate hennins and jeweled veils disappeared. Margaret's hair was bound with simple veils or wimples, garments that reduced her presence to that of a respectable widow rather than a reigning queen. To enemies, this was perfect. A queen without regalia looked less like a ruler and more like a relic. Footwear, too, told its own story. Velvet shoes, embroidered with gold, had once carried Margaret through palaces. In the tower, she made do with plain leather boots or slippers, meant for durability, not splendor. Damp floors warped leather quickly, and shoes wore thin. Each step reminded her that her world had shrunk from royal progresses across England to pacing the confines of her cell. And yet, fashion in captivity could also become a subtle weapon. Margaret was clever enough to know that appearances mattered, even in reduced circumstances. Chronicles mention her maintaining an air of composure, ensuring she never looked broken before her guards. A freshly laundered veil, a gown laced just so these gestures projected resilience. If she could not control armies or councils, she could at least control how she carried herself. Fashion, then, became a paradox. It could humiliate, stripping her of royal image, but it also gave her the chance to resist quietly. Clothes that were meant to reduce her still became instruments of dignity. In the tower, every stitch was political, every hem a reminder of what had been lost and what she refused to let go. Margaret's wardrobe no longer dazzled with jewels, but it still told a story. It was the story of a queen who, though imprisoned, refused to dress like a victim. Entertainment. Medieval Netflix, without the chill. Imprisonment in the 15th century was not designed with entertainment in mind. There were no libraries of parchment romances at the ready, no troubadours on retainer, no courtly tournaments to break the monotony. The tower was built to contain, not to amuse. And yet, for someone like Margaret of Anjou, once Queen of England, accustomed to feasts, hunts, and the endless pageantry of court, the absence of distraction was itself a torment. A monarch who once presided over masques and sermons now found her leisure reduced to staring at damp stone. Still, medieval prisoners had to find ways to fill the hours. Music was one of the few consolations. Margaret may have been permitted a lute, harp, or psaltery, though not the professional musicians she once commanded. A servant plucking at strings in the corner was a far cry from a royal orchestra, but the sound echoed through the chamber, breaking the silence. Singing sacred hymns, or ballads, would have offered not only distraction but also a reminder of life beyond the tower walls. Books, for those who could access them, were another form of escape. Literacy among nobles was relatively high, and Margaret, raised in the French court, almost certainly read both French romances and devotional texts. Monastic chronicles note that imprisoned nobles often requested prayer books or psalters, both for piety and for something to do between meals of stale bread. A manuscript illuminated with saints might substitute for Netflix's scrolling thumbnails, endless variations on a theme, each promising salvation or despair. Reading was never purely entertainment, though it doubled as spiritual discipline, a reminder that even behind bars, God was watching. Conversation was a lifeline. Margaret's servants, though limited in number, gave her someone to argue with, confide in, or direct. Human company meant gossip about guards, whispered speculation about events in the kingdom, or even disputes over chores. For someone used to commanding entire councils, the narrowed circle of dialogue was claustrophobic. Yet, even the smallest conversation kept the mind alive. Chroniclers often noted that isolation was as destructive as hunger. Margaret's survival depended as much on talk as on food. Some prisoners turned to crafts. Needlework, embroidery, or weaving offered both practical output and a way to pass time. Queens and noblewomen often stitched altar cloths or devotional banners while confined. Margaret may have followed suit, her fingers working thread through linen as she replayed lost battles in her head. Later stories romanticized such labor, but in reality, it was simply survival. Each stitch marking another day endured. The tower itself, ironically, became a grim form of entertainment. Watching the comings and goings of guards, prisoners, and messengers offered glimpses of a wider world. From narrow windows, Margaret might see the Thames flowing past, barges carrying goods and soldiers, or even the faint outlines of the city beyond. It was like watching a living tapestry, fragmented, controlled, but still a reminder that life pulsed outside her cell. If Netflix offers us endless background noise, Margaret had the Tower courtyard, a set of repetitive dramas starring the same cast of wardens and servants. Prayer and ritual-filled hours, too. To modern eyes, kneeling for long stretches may look more like penance than entertainment. But for Margaret, prayer was both habit and solace. The liturgical calendar provided a rhythm, marking time by feasts and fasts. Hymns replaced binge-worthy series. Psalms substituted for episodic drama. Faith gave her structure when everything else was chaos. Of course, boredom also gnawed at her. Chroniclers often described long imprisonment as mentally crushing. Some nobles went mad, carving graffiti into walls, pacing endlessly, or muttering to themselves. Margaret was hardened by years of war, but even she must have felt the oppressive sameness of days. Entertainment was never abundant in captivity. It was cobbled together from scraps of memory, devotion, and willpower. And yet, the very act of seeking distraction became defiance. Margaret could not command armies, but she could still command her own attention. To pray, to sew, to sing, these were ways of refusing to let silence and stone consume her. The tower denied her comfort, but she found fragments of meaning, a makeshift playlist of music, ritual, and memory that kept despair at bay. Medieval Netflix, then, was not about endless choice. It was about survival programming, repeated endlessly, with no skip intro button. But for Margaret, each thread sewn, each psalm sung, each glance out the window was an episode in the long, grinding series of her captivity. Politics on pause, enemies at play. When Margaret of Anjou was locked away, her world shrank to stone walls and guarded doors. Yet outside the tower, England did not freeze in sympathy. Politics never paused simply because a queen was absent. If anything, her imprisonment opened the stage for her enemies to rewrite the script. The Wars of the Roses were not decided solely on the battlefield. They were shaped just as much by whispered alliances, opportunistic betrayals, and backroom maneuvers carried out while Margaret could do nothing but wait. Her captivity was meant to silence her influence, but politics abhors a vacuum. Richard of York had already tried to assert himself, but after his death at Wakefield in 1460, the mantle of leadership passed to his son Edward. Young, ambitious, and unburdened by Margaret's unpopularity, Edward moved swiftly to present himself as the face of stability. When he seized the crown as Edward IV in 1461, he embodied the Yorkist claim to legitimacy and promised an end to Lancastrian chaos. Margaret's imprisonment was therefore not only punishment, it was propaganda. The Yorkists could point to her silence as proof that their version of the story had triumphed. But silence does not mean absence. Even behind bars, Margaret remained a figure in the political imagination. Yorkist chroniclers painted her as the villainess of the kingdom's misfortunes, the foreign she-wolf who had dragged England into civil war. Every time Edward IV justified a new tax, or Warwick the kingmaker demanded loyalty, Margaret's shadow was invoked. Her incarceration allowed enemies to demonize her freely, knowing she could not answer back. It was politics on pause for her, but in reality, her reputation was being actively weaponized. Meanwhile, her son, Edward of Westminster, grew into a symbol of resistance. Though Margaret could not see him, she surely knew that Lancastrian loyalists rallied around his name. He represented continuity, the possibility that one day the crown might return to her line. Yet his youth also made him vulnerable to manipulation. Every noble who claimed to fight for the prince's rights was really fighting for his own slice of influence. Margaret's absence left him exposed to being molded into a pawn. Edward IV, for his part, used Margaret's silence to strengthen his own image. He staged elaborate court pageants, celebrated victories with tournaments, and emphasized his Englishness in contrast to the Queen's French birth. Every display of pomp was a performance of legitimacy, a way of saying, "Look who rules now. The foreign queen is locked away, and the kingdom is finally safe in native hands." It was theater, but theater with consequences, because it helped solidify loyalty among nobles who might otherwise have wavered. Beyond England's borders, Margaret's imprisonment did not go unnoticed. France and Scotland, long her allies, weighed their options carefully. Should they gamble on the Lancastrian cause, with its queen locked away and its king incapacitated? Or should they pivot toward alliances with Edward IV, the vigorous young ruler who actually sat on the throne? Her captivity signaled weakness to foreign courts. In the ruthless logic of medieval diplomacy, an imprisoned queen was less an ally than a liability. Inside England, the nobility played their own games. Families like the Nevilles and Percys maneuvered to expand their influence, while the Lancastrians faltered. Some defected openly to the Yorkists. Others stayed quiet, hedging their bets in case fortune shifted again. Politics without Margaret meant politics dominated by men eager to fill the gap she left. Yet the irony is that many of them defined themselves in opposition to her, whether by denouncing her ruthlessness or claiming to rescue the kingdom from her misrule. Even absent, she was unavoidable. The Tower kept her body confined, but her name circulated endlessly in proclamations, propaganda, and rumor. She was reduced to a symbol, and symbols can be powerful. The Yorkists needed her as a scapegoat. The Lancastrians needed her as a rallying point. Margaret, powerless to act, remained indispensable as a political ghost, haunting every council chamber and battlefield. Thus, her captivity was not a pause at all. It was a dangerous silence that allowed her enemies to speak louder. Every day she spent in confinement, others rewrote her story, recast her reputation, and rearranged the kingdom's loyalties. For Margaret, the true agony was not just the stone and iron around her, but the knowledge that history was being shaped without her hand upon the quill. Letters from the void. Stone walls may have trapped Margaret of Anjou's body, but parchment and ink gave her a fragile form of escape. Medieval prisons were rarely places of absolute silence. Letters could be smuggled out, carried by sympathetic servants, or intercepted and twisted into weapons. For a queen whose voice was her only remaining weapon, the act of writing became both a lifeline and a gamble. Every sentence that left her hands risked capture, but every sentence also offered the possibility of reaching allies who had not yet abandoned her. Medieval letters were not casual notes scribbled in haste. They were political instruments, formal declarations dressed in the language of loyalty, grievance, and plea. Margaret understood this well. To write was to command, even if the ink dried far from the battlefield. Scholars believe that several Lancastrian correspondences bear her influence messages urging supporters to hold fast, reminding them of her son's rightful claim, and painting Edward IV as a usurper who had stolen both throne and stability. The tower might cage her, but words could still slip through the bars. Yet the danger of letters was obvious. Prison walls did not guarantee privacy. They ensured surveillance. Intercepted correspondence could confirm suspicions, expose allies, or justify harsher confinement. A single careless phrase might doom an entire faction. Margaret had to weigh every word as though it were a soldier on the battlefield, sent forth with purpose but vulnerable to capture. Her pen was a sword, but a double-edged one. Some of these letters were written not just to generals or nobles, but to foreign rulers. Margaret knew that France and Scotland remained potential lifelines. France was her homeland. Scotland had long feuded with England and could benefit from continued divisions south of the border. Messages sent northward or across the Channel asked for troops, gold, or at the very least recognition of her son as the legitimate heir. Whether those letters reached their destinations or were quietly intercepted remains uncertain. But the intent is clear. Even in chains, Margaret attempted to practice diplomacy. Inside the tower, writing could also serve another purpose: preserving sanity. Chroniclers rarely dwell on this aspect, but it is easy to imagine her scribbling drafts, rephrasing pleas, or recording thoughts simply to keep her mind from unraveling. Isolation breeds despair, and the scratch of a quill across parchment could be a small act of defiance against silence. Even if no messenger ever carried a letter beyond the gate, the act of composition allowed her to feel like a queen still engaged in rule. Her enemies, however, knew the power of letters as well. Yorkist propaganda often claimed to quote Margaret's supposed words, painting her as vengeful or foreign in sympathies. Whether authentic or forged, these letters circulated in pamphlets and chronicles, shaping public perception. In this sense, Margaret's voice was stolen and remixed against her will. Even as she tried to reach allies, the Yorkists were already speaking louder on her behalf, crafting a villainous version of the Queen that reinforced their narrative of rightful conquest. The paradox of Margaret's imprisonment was thus revealed in her correspondence. She was silent, yet she spoke. She was absent, yet she remained present in ink and rumor. Each letter, whether smuggled or intercepted, confirmed that she still mattered enough to monitor, to fear, and to slander. The Queen who could not ride at the head of armies now rode on the fragile wings of parchment. Fragile, but not powerless. And so, the tower became not just a physical cell, but a communications hub of sorts, where guards, messengers, allies, and enemies intersected over scraps of vellum. Margaret's words, half heard and half lost, moved outward in uncertain arcs, sometimes landing where intended, sometimes turning against her. The void was not empty. It was an echo chamber. She wrote into it, hoping her voice would return multiplied, but always aware that it might be swallowed whole. In the end, the story of her letters is less about their exact contents and more about their existence. They prove that Margaret never surrendered to silence. Even locked away, she fought to remain part of England's political bloodstream, scratching out her defiance line by line. And while the tower could smother her presence, it could not erase her words. The guards, frenemies in armor. For most prisoners of the tower, survival hinged not only on chains or walls, but on the men assigned to watch them. Guards were the invisible thread stitching together daily existence, sometimes protectors, sometimes tormentors, often both at once. For Margaret of Anjou, guards became the closest thing to a permanent court. Their steel and silence framed her world, and every interaction carried weight. In theory, guards were neutral. They served the crown, not their own whims. In practice, they were men caught in the same whirlpool of politics that had swallowed Margaret. Some were Lancastrian sympathizers pressed into Yorkist service. Others were opportunists who saw guarding a queen as a stepping stone to favor. A handful were hardened professionals who treated their duties like any other job: keep the prisoner alive, fed, and unable to escape. Each guard came with his own loyalties, suspicions, and ambitions, and Margaret had to learn quickly who was friend, foe, or something in between. Interactions with guards blurred the line between captivity and companionship. These men were not faceless statues. They were the ones who delivered her food, carried her water, and barred her doors at night. They overheard her sighs, saw her moments of despair, and sometimes caught fragments of her whispered prayers. In a sense, they became unwilling witnesses to the private unraveling of a queen. That intimacy created its own strange form of power. Guards could become confidants, or they could weaponize what they learned against her. Bribery and persuasion were constant undercurrents in the tower. Coins, promises, or even kind words could soften a guard's vigilance. Margaret, who had grown up navigating royal courts, understood this better than most. She may have lacked armies, but she still wielded charisma and authority. A sympathetic guard might smuggle in a letter, delay a cruel order, or slip an extra blanket into her chamber. These small gestures carried outsized importance in a life defined by deprivation. But the reverse was also true. Guards could tighten the screws of misery. A hostile one might deny her a candle, spread rumors about her defiance, or deliberately expose her words to Yorkist ears. They could turn a routine search into humiliation, or a mealtime into insult. Because guards held keys, they also held choices. Mercy or cruelty. Leniency or strictness. For Margaret, every day meant recalculating her relationship with the men in armor who controlled the rhythm of her confinement. Some guards may have been spies as much as jailers. It was common practice for captors to place trusted men near important prisoners, not only to prevent escape, but to gather intelligence. A careless remark about foreign allies, a reference to loyal nobles, or even a bitter curse against Edward IV could all be reported back to higher authorities. For Margaret, the knowledge that every conversation might echo beyond her cell made trust nearly impossible. Was the guard who brought her bread a silent ally, or the sharpest enemy at her elbow? Yet despite suspicion, human bonds sometimes formed. Guards lived within the tower walls as well. They shared the same drafts, the same endless stone, the same monotony. In rare cases, proximity blurred hostility. Margaret remained a queen, after all, and centuries of deference to royalty could soften even hardened hearts. Respect, if not loyalty, might develop in small acts. A lowered voice, a polite bow, a refusal to repeat every word she spoke. Such gestures reminded her that she was not entirely erased from the world of rank and honor. The irony of her imprisonment was that her enemies trusted ordinary men to contain a woman they feared politically. The tower's strength lay less in stone and more in these guards' choices. If even one turned sympathizer, a door might open, a letter might fly, or an escape might be plotted. If all turned cold, then Margaret's world shrank to a locked room and the hollow echo of armored boots pacing the corridor. Margaret of Anjou's fate was thus not shaped only by kings, dukes, and generals, but also by anonymous men whose names history rarely records. They were her jailers, her shadows, her audience, and occasionally her lifeline. For 30 years, their presence defined the borders of her life, leaving her suspended between danger and survival. In their hands, a queen's dignity flickered, sometimes protected, sometimes extinguished, but never ignored. Rumors, legends, and medieval gossip columns. The Tower of London was not a silent tomb. Its stones carried whispers, and its halls buzzed with tales that stretched, bent, and reshaped the truth. In the 15th century, rumor was not idle chatter. It was a weapon, a form of currency, and sometimes the only news bulletin ordinary people could access. For Margaret of Anjou, imprisoned and powerless, rumors became both her enemy and her legacy. Medieval England thrived on gossip. There were no newspapers or printing presses spreading official statements, so stories traveled mouth to mouth, tavern to tavern, and market to market. Priests slipped comments into sermons, minstrels spun tales in song, and peddlers repeated whatever made their wares more interesting. When it came to royalty, gossip carried enormous power, shaping reputations long before facts could catch up. In Margaret's case, her absence from public life only sharpened curiosity. People wanted to know what the infamous queen was doing behind the tower's walls. Some rumors painted her as a tragic figure, an abandoned queen languishing in darkness, betrayed by fate. These tales stirred pity, suggesting her imprisonment was undeserved. Others cast her as a schemer still plotting from her cell, communicating in coded letters and whispering with foreign agents through bribed guards. Neither version was wholly accurate, but each served political ends. To Yorkists, spreading stories of her villainy justified her imprisonment. To secret Lancastrian loyalists, portraying her as a martyr kept the flame of resistance alive. The juiciest rumors often centered on her motherhood. Margaret's devotion to her son, Edward of Westminster, was legendary, and enemies twisted it into scandal. Whisper campaigns suggested he was illegitimate, or worse, that Margaret had placed her own ambition above maternal care, dragging him through wars and exile. For her supporters, the opposite narrative thrived. She was a lioness defending her cub at any cost. In taverns across England, arguments over the Queen could sound less like politics, and more like gossip over a neighbor's misdeeds. Legends sprouted in captivity too. Tales circulated that Margaret had hidden jewels within the tower walls, or that she communed with dark forces to curse her enemies. Some chroniclers, eager to dramatize events, described her as half-witch, half-she-wolf, a foreign sorceress haunting English soil. These legends were not neutral. They reflected the deep misogyny and xenophobia of her time, where a powerful woman could only be explained as monstrous or unnatural. Gossip, in this sense, became a way of policing behavior. No queen should wield more authority than her husband, and if she did, rumor would cut her down. Inside the tower, Margaret herself likely caught fragments of these whispers. Guards carried news, servants repeated market chatter, and visiting clerics sometimes shared concerns, disguised as spiritual counsel. For a prisoner already stripped of agency, the knowledge that her image outside was being rewritten must have been maddening. She could not attend court to defend herself. She could not stand before Parliament to argue her cause. Instead, her reputation lived and died through the words of others. But gossip was a double-edged sword. Just as her enemies weaponized it, her allies could use it strategically. The idea that Margaret still plotted in captivity might inspire loyalists to keep faith. Tales of her endurance under harsh conditions could transform her into a symbol of Lancastrian resilience. Gossip kept her name alive, and in a political landscape where forgotten figures disappeared quickly, visibility was power. The tower itself amplified these rumors. It was not merely a prison. It was a stage. To the public, its looming walls represented authority and mystery. People imagined what they could not see, and imagination often exaggerated reality. If Margaret coughed during prayers, someone outside claimed she was deathly ill. If she received a visitor, whispers spread that a Lancastrian conspiracy was brewing. The tower's silence invited speculation, and speculation became story. In the end, Margaret's confinement ensured that she could not control her own narrative. Instead, her legend was built by others, chroniclers with agendas, enemies with grudges, and commoners who preferred sensational tales to boring truths. Yet in a strange way, these gossip columns of the medieval world preserved her memory. Had she faded quietly into obscurity, history might have lost her entirely. Instead, rumor carved her name into England's collective imagination. For better or worse, Margaret of Anjou was never forgotten. She was vilified, pitied, mocked, and admired, but she remained talked about. And in an age where survival often meant being remembered, gossip gave her a kind of immortality, even as her body languished behind stone walls. Health and despair. Life in the tower was not merely an exercise in patience, it was a relentless test of physical endurance and mental resilience. For Margaret of Anjou, years of confinement took a heavy toll on both body and mind. Medieval prisons were never designed with hygiene or comfort in mind, and even queens could not escape the reality of sickness, malnutrition, and the constant stress of captivity. In this environment, health and despair were inseparable companions, each feeding off the other. Margaret's diet, already limited by the tower's provisions, was far from nutritious. Fresh produce was scarce. Meat was inconsistent, and fish, often the safest food available, was still subject to spoilage. Illnesses caused by contaminated food or water were common. Dysentery, scurvy, and respiratory infections thrived in damp, poorly ventilated quarters. Margaret, accustomed to a royal lifestyle of feasts and abundance, had to adjust to rationed meals and bland diets. The physical strain of malnutrition weakened her immune system, leaving her vulnerable to the many diseases that plagued medieval London. Sanitation in the tower was rudimentary at best. Privies were primitive, often little more than holes in the floor or buckets emptied infrequently. Insects, lice, and rats were constant companions. Water for drinking and washing was not always clean, and the damp stone walls encouraged mold and mildew growth. Chronic respiratory issues were common among prisoners. Margaret's quarters, once filled with tapestries and furniture, likely became breeding grounds for mold, making breathing difficult and exacerbating any existing ailments. Illness was only part of the burden. Mental health in the tower was an even greater concern. Isolation, uncertainty about her fate, and the loss of her husband and son created a psychological environment that would challenge anyone. Medieval society lacked the language or understanding to describe depression or anxiety. Captives were expected to endure silently, relying on prayer and religious consolation. Margaret, however, had been a politically active, strong-willed queen. Being reduced to inactivity and waiting would have been profoundly frustrating, likely amplifying feelings of helplessness and despair. Medical care was primitive and often dangerous. Physicians relied on the theory of the four humors, prescribing bloodletting, herbal concoctions, or purgatives. Treatments could be more harmful than beneficial, and remedies varied widely in effectiveness. Access to skilled medical care for prisoners, even for a queen, was inconsistent. Illness could linger, untreated or poorly treated, eroding both physical health and morale. Margaret's confined life meant she could not exercise or maintain the routines that had supported her well-being before captivity. Sleep, another critical factor in health, was disrupted by the tower's environment. The sounds of guards, visitors, and other prisoners could intrude at any hour. Damp, cold stone walls made nights uncomfortable, and bedding was often insufficient. Fatigue compounded other health problems, weakening the body further and diminishing resistance to infection. The cyclical interplay of poor diet, illness, and sleep deprivation created a downward spiral that was difficult to escape. Despite these harsh conditions, Margaret's resilience was remarkable. Chroniclers noted her ability to endure years of imprisonment without public complaint, maintaining dignity and composure. She survived not because the tower was kind, but because she adapted to its relentless challenges. Physical suffering and mental strain became routine, almost a background to her daily existence, yet they never fully broke her spirit. In the tower, despair was as tangible as the walls themselves. Every day offered reminders of her lost power, her deceased family, and the precariousness of her position. Health, such as it was, became a battlefield in its own right, a struggle to maintain strength while facing the slow erosion of body and mind. Margaret's life in confinement illustrates the intimate link between physical suffering and psychological anguish in medieval captivity, showing that imprisonment was not only about losing freedom, it was about surviving the endless assault on one's very being. Even in such dire circumstances, Margaret persisted. Her body weakened, her spirit tested, yet she endured. The tower was a crucible, stripping away comfort, autonomy, and security, but it could not fully extinguish the resilience that had once made her a queen. Health and despair were constant companions, shaping a life defined by endurance, isolation, and the struggle to survive behind unforgiving walls. Occasional perks of being a tower resident. Life in the Tower of London was largely a mix of confinement, discomfort, and endless waiting. Yet, even in such an oppressive environment, Margaret of Anjou discovered occasional, unexpected advantages, small perks that, while minor compared to her former royal freedom, offered fleeting moments of relief or distraction. Medieval imprisonment was harsh, but it was rarely absolute deprivation. A queen still carried her dignity, her entourage, and certain privileges, however limited. One of the first perks was privacy. Though Margaret was constantly watched by guards, her living quarters in the tower were far more private than the bustling courts she once navigated. She had space to retreat, to read, pray, or reflect, without the constant interruptions of courtiers, petitions, and ceremonial obligations. For someone who had spent years directing armies and negotiating treaties, even the monotony of quiet could feel like a reprieve from relentless political pressure. The tower's isolation, grim as it was, provided a strange kind of sanctuary from the endless demands of court life. Another benefit was security. While imprisonment inherently meant restrictions on freedom, the tower was also a formidable fortress. Margaret was safe from assassination plots, mob violence, and the kind of sudden danger that had plagued her earlier years. In a sense, her captors ensured her survival. Henry VI's fate, a quiet murder in captivity, was a constant reminder that being in the tower was safer than wandering in the chaos of civil war. Life behind stone walls provided protection, even if it came at the cost of liberty. Margaret also retained access to attendants and servants, albeit on a reduced scale. While these individuals were not numerous, and their resources limited, they provided help with basic needs, from preparing food to tending to clothing and other necessities. Unlike ordinary prisoners, she could still command assistance for personal tasks, a small echo of her former authority. The presence of familiar attendants offered companionship and mitigated the sense of isolation that might have been otherwise unbearable. These small human connections became vital lifelines, sustaining morale in an environment designed to strip prisoners of dignity. Communication with the outside world, though restricted, was another rare perk. Margaret received letters, visitors, and occasional news of France and England. Each correspondence was a reminder that she was not entirely erased from the political or social sphere. The ability to read and respond to letters offered intellectual stimulation and emotional connection. Even brief messages could provide hope, spark memories of her past life, or serve as tools for political maneuvering. However constrained by her captors, health provisions, though basic, were also marginally better than for typical prisoners. Margaret had access to medicinal treatments, herbal remedies, and warm bedding in comparison to those locked in dungeons or common cells. While the care was far from luxurious, it was sufficient to sustain her life over decades, allowing her to survive illnesses that might have killed a less privileged captive. Survival itself became a form of privilege when viewed against the mortality of other prisoners of the era. Entertainment, surprisingly, could occasionally reach her quarters. Minstrels, visiting nobility, or other residents of the tower might provide music or conversation. Though irregular and limited, these interactions offered a break from monotony and a reminder of life beyond the cold stone walls. Even fleeting diversions, watching the changing seasons from a window, or hearing news of distant events served as mental escapes, small islands of normalcy in an otherwise confining reality. Margaret's enduring status as a queen conferred intangible perks as well. She was still addressed with respect, her rank recognized even by captors and visiting officials. This preserved dignity mattered psychologically, reinforcing a sense of identity and authority that could never be fully taken away. The symbolic weight of her crown, even in absentia, provided a measure of personal strength in the face of isolation. While life in the tower was defined by confinement, deprivation, and constant surveillance, these occasional perks, privacy, safety, attendance, correspondence, basic medical care, and the recognition of her royal status, offered Margaret small reprieves. They reminded her that she was still Margaret of Anjou, a queen in exile rather than a common prisoner. Even in a setting designed to erase her influence, these limited advantages allowed her to retain dignity, sustain hope, and endure the long years of captivity with as much resilience as possible. Plots of escape and why they failed. Imprisonment often sparks imagination, and for Margaret of Anjou, decades in the Tower of London were no exception. The very nature of captivity's stone walls, locked gates, and constant surveillance fueled both desperation and creativity. Over the years, she considered and attempted, at least in planning, multiple avenues of escape. Yet each scheme either failed outright or remained a tantalizing what if, thwarted by a combination of logistical, political, and human obstacles. Margaret's captivity demonstrates a medieval lesson as stark as it is timeless. Plotting freedom is far easier than achieving it. One of the earliest challenges was simply timing. The tower was a fortress, but it was also a highly organized institution. Guards were stationed strategically, doors were bolted and barred, and movements of prisoners were monitored. Any plan that required leaving her quarters unnoticed faced near impossible odds. Unlike modern prisons, where isolation can be partial, Margaret's captivity was designed to prevent even minor lapses in security. She was under constant eyes, both visible and hidden, and any attempt to slip away required coordination that her limited network could rarely provide. Communication with allies outside the tower was another major hurdle. Margaret still had loyal supporters in England and abroad, but contacting them discreetly was extraordinarily difficult. Messages could be intercepted, letters might be censored or delayed. A single betrayal could doom the entire plan. Her correspondences often revealed her political ambitions more than practical escape routes, and the security forces of the tower were well aware of her connections. Even trusted messengers carried risk, making any escape attempt a high-stakes gamble. Political considerations also undermined practical escape. Margaret was not a common prisoner. She was a queen in exile. Her captors were cautious, Killing her outright might have created a martyr, but allowing her to flee posed the same danger in reverse. A free queen could reignite Lancastrian resistance. The very fact of her royal status meant that any escape plan had to account for the potential repercussions beyond the tower walls. Planners were forced to weigh the chance of freedom against the certainty of renewed conflict. And for many of Margaret's would-be rescuers, the risk was too great. Physical constraints of the tower itself were another factor. High walls, deep moats, and controlled access points made stealthy departures nearly impossible. Margaret could not scale stone barriers or slip through secret passages without outside help, and outside help was unreliable. Even if a plan succeeded at one stage, it might fail at another. A gate locked at the wrong time, a guard changed unexpectedly, or a boat unavailable at the riverbank. Every escape scenario required perfect coordination across multiple variables, an improbability given the medieval resources and communications available. Human factors fear, mistrust, and loyalty also played a critical role. Potential accomplices often hesitated, wary of reprisal. Guards might be bribed, but bribery carried immense risk. A single informant could unravel the entire scheme. Margaret's attendants were loyal, but not invincible or omnipotent. Every human element added uncertainty, and in a medieval world where betrayal was common, caution often outweighed daring. Even those who supported her politically sometimes counseled patience over action, reinforcing the tower's effective containment. Despite these obstacles, Margaret did not abandon the idea of escape entirely. The very plotting gave her something to focus on, a mental diversion from the monotony and despair of long-term confinement. Schemes of tunnels, secret exits, and smuggled boats filled her imagination. They kept alive a sense of agency, even if unrealized. In a place designed to strip her of influence, the act of planning, however futile, was a psychological lifeline. Ultimately, no plan succeeded. Margaret remained in the tower for years, her freedom indefinitely postponed by architecture, logistics, politics, and human caution. Escape, in her case, was never a question of desire but of possibility. And possibility was relentlessly constrained. Her failed attempts, or even the contemplation of them, serve as a reminder of the harsh realities of medieval imprisonment. The human spirit can plot endlessly, but walls, gates, and circumstance often win the day. Margaret's captivity in the tower illustrates a timeless truth. Confinement breeds ingenuity, but the combination of political vigilance, structural security, and human limitations makes actual escape nearly impossible. Her plots, whether executed or merely imagined, were acts of resistance in their own right. Though she never regained her liberty through cunning or stealth, these efforts reflected resilience, persistence, and the undying hope that even in the darkest prisons, the mind remains free. Passing the years, 950 days of déjà vu, decades in captivity compress life into a series of repetitive routines, where one day blends seamlessly into the next. For Margaret of Anjou, nearly 30 years in the Tower of London amounted to exactly that, a marathon of monotony stretching across 950 days. Each day offered the same narrow confines, meager meals, and the hum of distant life she could no longer touch. Time, which in freedom seems fluid and malleable, became rigid, measured only by the sun filtering through her narrow windows and the tolling of church bells echoing beyond the walls. In this environment, even small changes a new servant, a slightly different dish, a rare letter felt monumental. Life followed a predictable rhythm. Meals arrived with the same attendants, often small, tasteless, or cold. Servants moved quietly through her chambers, performing their duties with disciplined detachment, while guards came and went, their presence a constant reminder of the walls that confined her. Margaret marked the passing seasons not by calendars or festivities, but by subtle cues, the early chill of winter mornings, the distant hum of summer activity in the courtyards, or the quiet stillness of autumn evenings. Even occasional letters or snippets of news from the outside world punctuated her days. Yet these interruptions were brief and fleeting. The world outside continued with all its vibrancy and complexity, while her existence remained a rigid cycle of confinement, observation, and endurance. Boredom was not merely a nuisance, it was a continuous test of mental stamina. The human mind craves novelty, yet Margaret had none to indulge in. She turned inward, reading, writing, and praying to preserve her mental sharpness. Reflection became both pastime and lifeline, allowing her to reconstruct memories, rehearse political strategies, and relive moments of her life with scrutiny. Each day became a deliberate exercise in creativity and mental discipline, a way to maintain some sense of agency within the confines of her imprisonment. In a profound sense, she was both prisoner and historian, documenting and analyzing her own life in real time, even as the external world moved on without her. Loneliness compounded the sense of déjà vu. Few companions were permitted, and those she saw were primarily attendants or guards, their interactions formal and constrained. Conversations were brief, procedural, and often devoid of warmth, reinforcing the starkness of isolation. Letters from family or supporters offered the occasional lifeline, yet even these became predictable. Updates on politics, inquiries about her health, expressions of concern. The repetitive rhythm of communication mirrored the repetitive rhythm of her life, emphasizing both the slow passage of time and her resilience in enduring it. Despite her isolation, Margaret's mind remained sharply attuned to the broader political landscape. She followed the twists and turns of English and French politics, assessed shifting allegiances, and considered the fates of former allies and rivals alike. Though unable to act directly, this mental engagement became a form of resistance. Each day in the tower sharpened her awareness, reinforcing a sense of identity that stone walls could never fully constrain. Though her body was trapped, her intellect roamed freely, traversing battlefields, councils, and courts in the theater of her imagination. Health challenges compounded the difficulties of captivity. Poor nutrition, damp living conditions, and the psychological toll of endless repetition made survival precarious. Even mundane routines, eating, bathing, resting, required careful attention, as neglect could invite illness or despair. In this way, ordinary actions assumed weighty significance, transforming daily monotony into a constant exercise in survival and self-preservation. Over time, Margaret's identity evolved. She was no longer solely queen consort or mother of an heir. She became a symbol of endurance. Each day reinforced her patience, reflection, and adaptability. She learned to extract meaning from repetition, turning monotony into structure and stability. 10,950 days of déjà vu could have crushed her spirit, yet she transformed them into a testament to resilience and the power of the human mind to endure. Ultimately, the passing years highlight the contrast between physical constraint and mental freedom. The tower imposed limits on her movements, yet her mind remained expansive, observing, analyzing, and remembering. Life in stone walls tested every aspect of her being, but it also proved that even in confinement, the human capacity to endure, imagine, and preserve identity persists. Margaret's decades of repetition were not merely punishment, they were proof that the mind can remain free, even when the body is bound. When the outside world forgot, time moved differently within the walls of the Tower of London. For Margaret of Anjou, decades of confinement turned life into a slow, repetitive rhythm, and the world beyond her cell gradually receded from view. Political crises, alliances, and battles continued. Yet she experienced them only through fragments, an occasional letter, a rumor, or the faint echo of distant news. The immediacy of power, once the defining pulse of her life, had been replaced by long stretches of waiting, observing, and imagining. Slowly, the outside world seemed to forget her, as if the very memory of her influence was fading from public consciousness. Days and months blurred together, leaving only the contours of monotony to define her existence. At first, correspondents and visitors maintained a tenuous connection. Letters arrived from loyal supporters, family, or foreign allies, bringing news of her son, the precarious state of Lancastrian forces, and occasional reports from France. Each message reminded her that life and danger continued beyond her confinement. Yet over time, the stream of communication diminished. Allies died, loyalties shifted, and letters became infrequent or delayed. Once at the center of events, Margaret increasingly existed only as a memory, a figure recalled in stories rather than actively shaping them. Slowly, she became more observer than participant, forced to experience history from the sidelines. Isolation reinforced this sense of invisibility. Within the tower, days merged, the toll of distant bells, the seasonal changes glimpsed through narrow windows, the monotony of meager meals. Visitors were rare, and attendants spoke only as duty required. Letters, when they arrived, were predictable. Inquiries about her health, reports on politics she could not influence, or polite expressions of concern. The outside world carried on, vivid and unrestrained, while she remained trapped in a fixed, unchanging rhythm. Even events of great importance, a new treaty, a change of rulers, or a rebellion, reached her only as whispers or delayed reports, stripped of immediacy and urgency. Psychologically, the experience was profound. Margaret had once commanded armies, brokered alliances, and wielded influence over kingdoms. To see the world continue without her input underscored the brutal truth that power, once lost, fades from collective memory. Yet in the silence, she cultivated a new form of engagement. Reflection and mental vigilance became vital tools for endurance. Her intellect turned into a refuge, preserving identity when the external world ignored her. Thoughts became her companions, imagination her escape, and memory her link to a life increasingly distant from reach. Margaret reconstructed events from partial information, analyzed the movements of allies and enemies, and replayed political scenarios in her mind. She tracked shifting alliances in France and England, considered the fates of friends and foes, and rehearsed strategies she could no longer implement. The tower could constrain her body, but it could not confine her mind. In solitude, she became both historian and strategist, chronicling events from which she was increasingly excluded. Each day was an opportunity to refine understanding, to preserve the lessons of power, and to sustain a sense of purpose amidst captivity. Loneliness sharpened her resilience. The absence of regular companionship forced her to rely on memory and reflection to maintain a sense of continuity. Repetitive routines, once oppressive, became scaffolding for mental endurance. Margaret learned to extract meaning from the monotony, turning isolation into a crucible for patience, observation, and careful thought. Even as the world outside moved on, she remained attentive, her awareness keen and deliberate, observing patterns, noting shifts, and imagining the decisions she might still influence in theory. Physically, the tower imposed limits, yet her intellect roamed freely. She imagined courts, negotiations, and battles far beyond the stone walls, keeping herself mentally connected to a world that had largely forgotten her. Public invisibility did not erase presence. Through thought, observation, and reflection, she retained a private sovereignty. Each day became an assertion of identity, a quiet resistance to erasure, a testament to the enduring strength of mind over circumstance. Ultimately, Margaret's decades in confinement reveal a paradox. One can be forgotten by the world and yet remain fully oneself. The tower muted her voice and curtailed her influence, but her mind remained active, reflective, and sovereign. Even when the outside world ignored her, Margaret endured, demonstrating the enduring power of intellect and resilience. Though physically imprisoned, she retained the capacity to observe, remember, and imagine, a testament to the freedom of thought in the midst of relentless constraint, a quiet victory over time and neglect. Release at last. After nearly 3 decades behind the tower walls, Margaret of Anjou finally glimpsed freedom. Her release, though delayed by political caution and the shifting priorities of the English crown, marked the end of a confinement that had lasted 19 years. For a woman whose life had once been defined by authority, armies, and courtly influence, the world outside now felt both familiar and alien. The streets she had once walked as queen had changed. The faces she remembered were gone, replaced by new generations unaware of her former power. Yet the mere act of leaving the tower was transformative freedom, even measured and conditional. Was a sensation she had almost forgotten. Her release was carefully orchestrated. King Edward IV, wary of her influence and the possibility of renewed Lancastrian plots, ensured that her movements would be closely monitored. She was allowed to reside in the custody of relatives abroad rather than return directly to England's political stage. While her liberation removed the physical barriers that had constrained her, the shadow of political strategy followed her closely. Margaret's freedom was not simply personal. It was a calculated decision by a monarchy that had long weighed her presence as both a threat and a symbol. Stepping outside the tower, Margaret was confronted by the paradox of liberation. The air felt different, carrying scents and sounds she had long been denied. Light, which she had glimpsed only through narrow windows, seemed more intense, more vivid. Trees, birds, and the flow of life beyond stone walls reminded her that existence had a rhythm beyond regimented meals, guards, and monotonous routines. Every step carried a weight of memory, The walls that had contained her for decades loomed in recollection even as they receded from view. Emotionally, the release was complex. Margaret had endured loneliness, monotony, and deprivation. Yet she had also cultivated resilience, mental acuity, and strategic thought. Freedom brought relief, but also disorientation. The world she had imagined from behind bars was no longer entirely recognizable. Political structures had shifted, allies had died or lost influence, and enemies had secured their positions. Even in liberty, Margaret understood that her ability to shape events was limited. She could move through the world physically, but the corridors of power were not as accessible as they had once been. Despite these limitations, the psychological impact of release was profound. Margaret experienced a restoration of autonomy, the ability to choose movement, engage in conversation, and occupy spaces not dictated by confinement. For someone who had spent the majority of her adult life in surveillance, this agency was transformative. Simple acts, such as walking through gardens, attending mass, or writing letters without interception, became demonstrations of personal sovereignty. Each decision was a reclaiming of authority, however modest, over her own life. Margaret's release also had symbolic resonance. To the public, it represented the end of an era of personal suffering linked to political conflict. She embodied endurance and the consequences of dynastic struggle. Those who had followed her story, whether through rumor, letters, or chronicled histories, recognized in her liberation a form of justice, even if partial and delayed. Her long imprisonment had become a cautionary tale about the volatility of power, the fragility of alliances, and the resilience required to endure betrayal. Although her active political influence was curtailed, Margaret's intellect and experience remained intact. She engaged in correspondence, advised trusted allies abroad, and reflected on the dramatic arc of her life. Freed from the Tower's confinement, she could exercise judgment and agency in ways previously impossible, demonstrating that liberty, even late in life, could reignite the human capacity for thought, reflection, and subtle influence. Ultimately, Margaret's release was both an end and a beginning. It closed the chapter of captivity, loss, and monotony, yet opened another that demanded adaptation to a world transformed by time and politics. Her legacy of endurance, mental resilience, and the capacity to survive even the harshest restrictions of power remained intact. In stepping beyond the Tower walls, Margaret of Anjou reaffirmed a truth she had long embodied, that the human spirit can persist, strategize, and endure even when confined, and that freedom, once regained, carries both relief and responsibility. Legacy of the Forgotten Queen. Margaret of Anjou's life was defined by extremes: power, loss, confinement, and endurance. Though often remembered in history as a she-wolf of France, her legacy extends far beyond the nicknames and propaganda that shaped public perception. The decades she spent in the Tower of London, removed from the centers of power, illustrate a story of resilience, intellect, and survival that challenges the traditional narrative of queenship and political defeat. In examining her life, one sees not merely a fallen queen, but a figure whose endurance became her most remarkable triumph. Her imprisonment made her a symbol of the consequences of dynastic conflict. The Wars of the Roses, with their shifting allegiances and brutal battles, transformed Margaret from an influential queen consort into a captive observer. Yet even in confinement, her presence loomed large. Chroniclers and enemies alike could not ignore her agency, and stories of her defiance and strategic thinking persisted. Letters she wrote, mental rehearsals of political events, and her careful observation of world affairs kept her connected to the very forces that had sought to erase her influence. In this sense, her legacy was forged not only in public action, but in the quiet persistence of thought under extreme restriction. The perception of Margaret as foreign and domineering complicated her historical remembrance. Contemporary chroniclers and propagandists emphasized her French origin, framing her actions as meddlesome or unnatural for an English queen. Yet modern interpretations reveal a woman deeply committed to her son's inheritance, the Lancastrian cause, and the survival of her family. Her so-called obstinacy was often the product of necessity, a combination of survival instinct and political acumen in a world that offered women few legitimate avenues for power. In enduring insults, xenophobia, and misogyny, Margaret demonstrated a resilience that extended beyond the battlefield. Margaret's long years of captivity also highlight the human capacity to adapt. life in the tower demanded not only physical endurance but also psychological resourcefulness. She maintained her intellect, preserved her identity, and exercised a form of internal sovereignty that no walls could fully constrain. Her routines, reading, writing, reflecting, and analyzing political developments, transformed confinement into an arena of mental exercise. In doing so, she modeled a type of leadership defined not solely by command over armies or lands, but by the ability to survive, strategize, and maintain agency under relentless limitation. The Queen's legacy also intersects with the broader history of women in power. Margaret's struggles exemplify the challenges faced by women whose authority was mediated through marriage, lineage, or societal expectation. Her life demonstrates the precarious balance required to assert influence without provoking political retaliation. By studying her experiences, historians gain insight into the ways women navigated medieval power structures, often relying on intelligence, patience, and endurance, as much as overt authority. Margaret's life becomes a lens through which the limitations and possibilities of female power in medieval Europe can be understood. Culturally, her story resonated long after her death. Tales of the she-wolf of France and the queen imprisoned in the tower entered folklore, literature, and historiography. While some accounts exaggerate her ruthlessness or dramatize her struggles, these stories preserve her presence in collective memory. They remind successive generations that political defeat does not necessarily equate to erasure. Influence can survive in memory, narrative, and example, even when official power has been stripped away. Ultimately, Margaret of Anjou's legacy is one of endurance and intellect. Her life demonstrates that a queen can exert influence beyond the throne, shaping political memory and historical perception through resilience and mental agility. Though history often focuses on her failures or her captivity, it is in these very trials that her remarkable strength is evident. Margaret's decades of confinement, political marginalization, and personal loss were not the end of her story, they were the crucible in which her enduring presence was forged. Her memory challenges traditional definitions of power. Margaret shows that leadership and influence are not only enacted through command or public action, but also through persistence, strategic thought, and the courage to survive in adverse circumstances. As a queen who was forgotten by the outside world, yet never surrendered her agency, Margaret of Anjou remains a compelling figure in history. A reminder that resilience and intellect can define a legacy as profoundly as crowns and battles.